This going on the like
Everything's going.
Oh
wait.
What you got on bag?
On the back.
Yeah, they open it up in the back.
Okay, I have one more umbrella. So we're just second umbrella.
I just keep it on way. Here we go. Can't wait.
I grew up in a home that really celebrated the historic relationships of Blacks and Jews in the Civil Rights Movement. I grew up playing in the home of Kibbe Kaplan, who was the first Jewish president of the NAACP. He was a longtime lay leader, brilliant visionary who really helped advance that organization. I grew up in my home seeing, a photograph of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Heschel, walking hand in hand over the Selma Bridge. I grew up hearing stories, of Rabbi Heschel, and he was asked, about taking leave from the Jewish Theological Seminary, what that experience was like marching in Selma. And he said, I was praying with my legs were worshiping. And many Jews, as they do social justice, I'll ask them in my research, I'll say, what verse from the Bible inspires your work in social justice? And they'll get a little embarrassed, right? They'll say, oh, my rabbi tries to teach us this material. But for many, if not for most, it is that statement of Rabbi Heschel, which they believe said, I was praying with my feet. As I study that historic relationship, I realized that it wasn't as widespread, that support for the civil rights movement among Jews. They were afraid, many were afraid to go down south. So it was the leadership and the young Jewish community that was most strongly and solidly engaged in the civil rights movement. After the lynching, the murder of George Floyd, an opportunity emerged that we could apply for a grant for racial justice, for education on issues related to racial justice in the Black community. So I called the Federation. They really encouraged me to submit a grant. It was a Friday. The grant was due Monday. I called Dr. Cindy Kistenberg. We've worked on many projects together, and we quickly wrote that grant proposal, and we were granted the funds.
Rabbi Judy asked me if it would be something I'd be interested in, and as the token Jewish person at a historically Black university for, let's say, 16 years, I thought it would be a great idea to bring in people from the Jewish community and the Black community and start a dialogue. One was needed.
I've been doing some work on another project with Judy Schindler and Cindy Kistenberg, and that work, it deals with racial equity as well. And so in doing that work, we found that we really like working with one another, but we also began to see some of the differences. The other work that I do around cultural competence, cultural inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm always looking to immerse myself into difference. So I'm always looking to expand myself. So with them doing the work that we've been doing together, and we like working with one another, and then this is what I kind of do as a living, it was second nature for me to want to do this. So I knew that there was a connection between the Black and Jewish communities during that time, but I wasn't as steeped in the history of it as I'm learning about it through this effort. So yeah, on the fringes, I knew that there was a relationship, but I didn't know to what degree.
We had some changes in leadership. So for the trip, we brought in Reverend Janet Garner Mullins. And what I think she brought to this first cohort was her history in Charlotte. She grew up in Brooklyn neighborhood. That was the community that was devastated by urban renewal, and she is a community activist and a community organizer, and we needed that voice and that spirit and that passion and that eloquence to really relate the struggles of the Charlotte Black community in a clear way to the participants in the Black Jewish Alliance.
Rabbi Judy and I have served together in the community on other organizations. Currently, we work together on the Coalition for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm a lifelong lover of social justice and environmental justice, and the opportunity to dialogue, first of all, to meet and to dialogue with diverse persons and cultures from an education and social justice empowerment was very stimulating for me. When I think about voluntary displacement, I think, well, if you go the same route every day down South Tryon Street to your job, you would never know the beauty of what's over on South Boulevard or what's over on West Boulevard because you're just going the same way. Voluntary displacement, you're moving from your normal, your familiar, to other life experiences that you would normally not have, and spend some time along with the group to share your life experiences, but most importantly, hear about their life experiences and relate history together and be enlightened by the plight of others.
I got involved with the Black Jewish Alliance because I was pushing a contact with the Jewish Federation about what the Jewish community was doing with racial justice programming. Rabbi Judy gave me a call and she was like, hey, I hear you're really interested in racial justice programming. We're doing this partnership with Queen's University and Johnson C. Smith, and it's for young professionals like you on educating and building advocacy about combating anti-Semitism and fighting racism. She asked me to be a co-chair, and I was like, I don't think I'm qualified for that, but I got involved and we got to pick an incredible group, and I guess I got in because the topic interests me, but now I'm in for the people, which has been really incredible because we just have such a thoughtful and insightful group, and I think social change happens with relationships.
Dr. K, Cindy told me about the Black Jewish Alliance group. She knows I love different cultures. I love to really learn another culture and see life through someone else's eyes. And she was telling me that, and I was like, oh, I'm for it. I'm waiting on the date. Tell me the date and time that you want to meet, and I'll make it work.
I got involved in the Black Jewish Alliance because my cousin, Jordan Bernstein, is a co-chair. I've always been interested in issues of racial justice, and so she reached out to say that a new kind of coalition was forming, and this sounded like something I'd be interested in and would I consider applying, and I'm grateful she did because it's been a wonderful experience.
I heard of it through another member of a board I'm on with Temple Bethel, with the social justice coordinator. So I had an email forwarded to me, and I was like, that sounds really cool. I'll apply and see what happens.
I learned about kind of a group event on Eventbrite, really focusing on the Brooklyn community here in Charlotte. Rabbi Judy Schindler was kind of leading that group, and that's when I initially met her and got familiar with the work that she was doing. It was kind of natural evolution to find this opportunity when she mentioned that she was working on this group, like, oh, it's a natural fit for me. Let me go ahead and get with this group.
For me, I've cared about the Black-Jewish relationship for a long time. I went to public school in Charlotte, East Meck High School in particular, which is, I believe, still maybe the most diverse school in Charlotte, North Carolina. We spent a lot of time talking about issues, and I got to learn firsthand from such a young age about challenges that other minorities face. I've been involved with the Greenspon Center for a number of years. I saw one day, because I follow them on Facebook, that they posted about a Black Jewish Alliance. Like, instantly, I knew I have to at least apply.
I work as an assistant public defender for Mecklenburg County. I had a coworker who was involved with Temple Bethel who had reached out to me saying that he thought I might be interested in this program because I was raised Jewish and do identify as Jewish, and I'm very interested in the history of social justice in this country and the civil rights movement.
One of my good friends, he is an alumni of Johnson C. Smith, and so his professor, Dr. K. Cindy Kissenberg, introduced it to him, and he introduced it to me. At first, I was a little apprehensive because I'm an introvert, but the idea showed me a vision of diversity, and it gave me an eye-opener where I could learn and glean from someone else other than myself or my comfort zone. So I was eager to be around other people to teach me their customs and their cultures.
We let our co-chairs really guide the process, and they created a map, a sketch of a map, like where are we, where are we going, how do we get there, are we there yet? You know, that would define each session. I think our session on anti-Semitism and racism, the history of both, was quite effective because people saw the struggles that the Black and Jewish community have experienced, they saw those struggles through a different lens.
It resonated with me because of all of the stereotypes I know that Black folks have to deal with. I could remember myself and another Black member having this discussion on the side when they talked about the stereotype of all of them are rich, right? That they have money and that they power a hoard, right? And that was a perspective that I had, right? I really thought record companies, they usually are run by Jewish, media usually, right? And to hear them really talk about how that's just not true, like that is a stereotype, it didn't dawn on me, really. And so to see it real life, up close and personal, that thing wasn't what I thought, I was like, okay, wow, this is definitely worth it.
I enjoyed when we watched the screening of the documentary that provides the history of Jewish and Black relations starting in the Civil Rights Movement and even before that to present, because it really solidified what I was interested in. Getting to see that history and to learn about it was the reason I wanted to be part of this program.
We were meeting at Queens College. I've never been to their campus. I've been in Charlotte for about 10 years, never been to their campus. I remember we watched the James Baldwin interview, and that stuck out to me because I was just like, I've never seen this. And I was just like, wow. And the things that he said, like, you take that with you, and to have that discussion and how that impacted other people that are not African American. How this African American impacted them and their walk of life, that really stood out to me. The fact that it wasn't just a Black thing. It wasn't just a Black problem or a Black issue, but it showed that, hey, other people relate to this too.
I don't know what I would say would be the most impactful. It might have been that panel. I've always felt like my involvement in social change hasn't been storming the beaches. So for me, the stuff that Rabbi Klass talked about, I understood my value, that I have a valuable role in this if I'm not in the streets marching all the time.
So I've seen photos and still shots of the King assassination. But I haven't seen some of those photos that they had in there, particularly the one, a photo where he was still on the balcony and one leg was up on the railing. They had his face somewhat covered, but you can still kind of see a little bit. Like that, for me, that and the picture of the gentleman who was cleaning up the blood afterwards, and it would seem like that's such a meaningless picture to have, but to sit there and know, and you can see the blood and all of what he was cleaning up, like that was King.
The political power was in the Black community, the economic power was in the white community, and the only way the city was gonna survive and thrive was the two work together. When I was at an American Jewish Committee staff meeting decades ago, one of my colleagues said, it's time to bring Blacks and Jews together because the voting rights is up for renewal. So I asked John Lewis, who was a city council member at the time, if he would speak. We invited 20 Blacks, 20 Jews, we met at the Federation. And it was unbelievable because everybody we asked came. And when John was through telling his story, people said, well, let's not stop now. We're all at the table. We've got this history. We have this desire. So we quickly formed, and I'm going to go quick through this, the letterhead that said Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition in support of voting rights. And we met with the editorial page of the paper. We met with our two senators, and we did what you do when you advocate. And the voting rights was renewed.
The stop in Atlanta was fascinating. The first stop where we had the panel discussion, I think people really got it. Like, these people have been at it for 40 years. right? This is what they've been working at. And a first cohort needs to lead to a second and a third and a 10th and a 20th. So I think they started to get it at the first stop. I think they were also frustrated by some of the presenters, and, that taught me how discerning this group was. And they're actually very critical and have very passionate feelings about what they want to learn and how they want to grow.
And done for over 40 years there in Atlanta, Georgia. And so it was great to hear the stories of the former mayor, to hear the stories of, it was Miss Sherry and Miss Cheryl, to hear those stories, to hear their history and their closeness of how they come together and walked in unity with one another, regardless of their differences.
We're kind of, in some ways, trying to model our program after that. So I think one of the biggest takeaways I had from that was really hearing what worked, what didn't work, and really the foundation of the relationship building that they were mentioning was really the success and the longevity of their movement.
So decades later, they're still sitting down for dinner every so often, and they've been there in the, big and little moments for each other.
Today, I find often that everybody decries white supremacy for everything. I actually think it's a problem for the way, because it means that nothing then, therefore, is white supremacy. If everything is, then nothing is. Jewish people are often seen as white and therefore perpetuating white supremacy. And that has created different types of conversations that we've had to address, because Jews are a minority as well, and that's something that we often have to remind people.
All of the conversation, the ambiguity, the subjectivity around the things that we've been talking about, it kind of centers to me where we are in this space and learning and growing as a new group. Like, if you're scaling this out, right, you're making it scalable, is what I just heard you saying.
Yeah.
What's the metric? What are the metrics? What are the indicators? How do you know that you're moving in a way, right? Like, is it the number of events that you advocate for? Yep. Is it the number of members? Like, what are the metrics?
Black-Jewish relations, to me, is actually primarily about the bridge building. It's not even about the metrics and the number of people that you can bring around to the table. It's actually about the longevity of the relationship that you can sustain.
The issues that some of us, and I will include myself in that, had with some of the comments in the panel were sort of focused on, these are my issues and this is what I think is important, and everything else is maybe blown out of proportion. But when I have a problem, or when it's anti-Semitism specifically, then everybody needs to pay attention and believe me and hear me.
If someone gives you feedback, can you hear it? Right? That's a big part of what we do as a group. We create a space where people can be vulnerable and ask questions and give feedback. And if you can't hear it, I have concerns about how you're, doing the other more important work than just this panel.
There's a Hillel quote, right, about basically the balance between the fight for yourself and the fight for other folks. And I think finding that balance sometimes is really hard, and sometimes we just need to take a step back and look at our perspective and where it's coming from.
Go into the tomb of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott. That was very moving to me, even though it was in the rain pouring. We were able to leave a stone and take a moment to commemorate him and his wife for all they did. That was very impactful to me.
It makes it real. It takes it outside of the textbooks that you had in 6th grade and outside of the pictures that you've seen on TV, and it's directly in front of you. That was special.
Martin Luther King was my role model growing up. And, my mom used to always say, well, why can't you have a role model that's alive? But, before I even knew I was going to become a pastor or a preacher or, whatever the title may be, I looked up to Dr. King because he made an impact on his people. He made an impact on everyone that was around him.
Going to Dr. Martin Luther King's grave and leaving stones on the grave was a very powerful act as Jews, because that's the way when we visit a cemetery, we leave stones on the grave. So it felt to me like a very Jewish act and a way to share our Jewish heritage with the Black community as we mourned, an amazing leader.
I wish it hadn't been pouring. To me, watching people put stones down at their graves, which we've since learned is not only just a Jewish tradition, some Blacks do it as well, although we have yet to find out the real reason behind it. I wanted to have time to reflect more, but we didn't have time to reflect more, to spend more time there. But to start the trip there, I think is important.
Birmingham for me was more of the political undertones of what's happening there, right? Like you didn't see the blight that you saw in Selma, but you could tell by when you interacted with folks that while you think this thing is good, it was just this steady thread of, we thought this was the past, right? But when we talk to folks and you see other things and it's like, okay, but this is still happening to some degree.
We did go to the temple in the morning. We've now learned that they've created tours to really highlight the Jewish partnership in the civil rights movement of Birmingham.
The synagogue was gorgeous. It was one of the largest synagogues I had seen in the South, if not the largest. It's very much a living history, which we saw when we went to the synagogue and had the presenter speak to us about the relationship between the temple and the civil rights activists in Birmingham and how that relationship is still developing today.
To see what role the Jewish community played in Birmingham, Alabama, it just makes me feel so good to know these people came together.
The Jewish community was caring enough to be involved in the civil rights movement, caring enough about persons of color, and not selfish in their gifts, in their talents, in their time, and in their resources. I thought a lot of that was very not only pleasing, but comforting to know that even though the struggle continues, we're not in it by ourselves.
The 16th Street Baptist Church, of course, once again, we hear about it on TV. We saw movies about it, but to actually stand in the atmosphere and in the presence of that ministry and that church.
They take you downstairs first and give you kind of an educational overview of the church and what happened there. And they sort of talk about the timeline of events that happened on that really sad and historic morning. And then you watch a video, and in the video they play a sound of a bomb going off, which was really just like a visceral experience for me that I sort of carried into going upstairs to the sanctuary, which by and large had been preserved. Kind of that experience of hearing that sound and feeling like almost like, oh wow, like really being in that space, and I kind of felt like, well, I could have been there that morning or that following week, was really powerful to me.
To hear the story of how when the bomb went off, there was a window with the picture of Jesus, and the only part of the window that was destroyed was his face. For me, that was a moment that said the Lord was affected by that movement, that he felt the very moment of death. He felt what those people went through. He felt and he was affected by what they experienced in that moment.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and take on the true meaning of its creed. See, aren't we all familiar with that speech given by Dr. King on that day of August of 1963?
I've known Ty probably more than 10 years, and I've heard that poem many, many times. And I think for the rest of his life, he is going to remember spitting that poem at 16th Street Baptist. I mean, I get chills just thinking about it.
I can't find a one-word emotion. It was great. Great is not the emotion, but it was great. And it was like, honestly, it was a dream come true. I'm going to take you back to the moment. In that actual moment, I was sitting there thinking, I was like, wow, Dr. King, from the podium that's directly behind me, he spoke a eulogy for these 3 little girls that I'm standing in a place that the caskets were. I had chills just going. It was everything. It was hurt. It was joy. It was anxiety. It was the progression. It felt like, I keep saying it felt like a long day, in the fact that it felt like Dr. King speaking up there and those girls being there wasn't 50, 60 years ago, but just, a few hours before.
Oh, that was great. I'm a huge hip hop fan. So anytime you can see spoken word or a performance live, it's great. And I could tell how meaningful it was to him. It really made me feel like we're still part of something important.
Shabbat dinner. was really important, that cultural exchange and that religious exchange is really important. You know, we have to share who we are and what our identity means to us. So we had a wonderful traditional Shabbat dinner. We were able to share some rituals. Our group put together the rituals they shared and the teachings that they shared and the music that they shared.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu.
The experience of participating in the Shabbat was a very good experience. I had not experienced that before. First, the food was great. Now, I'm not going to try to name some of the food because I didn't take notes, but the food was great. But the other thing that stood out to me was the ritual around it. Kind of felt like, you know, what happened in my house growing up. When it's time to sit down to eat Sunday dinner, right? If it was Big Mama's leading the prayer, right? You know, you have these discussions about just life, right? While you're in that space. And that's what that felt like for me.
It was really, really cool to be able to explain some of the Jewish traditions and why we do the things we do. And in Judaism, you know, there are so many old traditions that there's so many different reasons. So that was kind of cool being, you know, hearing other folks of like, oh, well, this is what I learned why we do this, and this is what I learned why we do this. And just being able to share like that sacred time with people who maybe haven't had a Shabbat dinner before. Also hearing what our non-Jewish Black participants thought of some of the rituals was really cool to kind of hear.
I had one many years ago when I went over to I was doing some work as a volunteer for AARP, North Carolina, and they had some of their volunteers here in Charlotte to go over to the Jewish Center at Temple Beth El and participate in the Shabbat dinner. The difference is this was at a table setting inside of a room with about 300 people at different tables, whereas this was a small confined space and done by much younger people. And so I thought the dinner went very well. I liked the information that was shared because I'm always about learning. And this was a total learning experience for me, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
It was fun. It was a new way of me learning my Jewish brothers and sisters in the group. And it also was one of the first times that I got to see some of them in different roles.
That seems insane that every week there's a holiday, but that's really what Shabbat feels like. It's a moment of rest and also joy. And it was really special to share that with everyone.
It was fun because even within Judaism, everybody has different practices. And whenever you're explaining something, you learn things about yourself and about your own religion just by explaining it. So I think that made me think about why do we do certain things on Shabbat I just take for granted.
Quite frankly, I went up with my guard up to some extent because of my faith, my conceived notions, the feelings that I have, and seeing their willingness to be vulnerable and really allowed me to become more comfortable and open up with the group more broadly, and kind of shed some of that burden I was carrying of keeping this wall up.
On Sunday morning in Birmingham, we decided to sort of spontaneous. We were debating how do we address religion in the Black Jewish Alliance? We're still working that out, right? You can have, Jews who are secular, whose identity is connected to peoplehood. You can have Jews who are Orthodox and, you follow Torah to the letter of the law as best as one can in 2022.
Do I consider myself a religious Jew? I would say yes, even though I wouldn't say I'm the best practicing religious Jew. It's kind of that stuff in the ether of something that keeps me really grounded and gives me guidance. I guess it's like trail markers for me on how to move forward. So even if that necessarily doesn't mean participating in the rituals as much as I would like, I think there's just a lot of comfort I gain from the rituals. I'll go to Torah study or something and learn something new, and I'll be like, right, that's why I'm in this religion. Got me like that. So, yeah.
There are underlying Jewish principles of the universal elements of it, where every human being is made in the image of God. Everyone has that deep sanctity to who they are, and so in some ways it's a little cheesy, like everybody likes to say it, but to actually hold that view, especially when there's disagreement, I think it my Judaism pushes me to do it.
I would say that religious Jew is kind of a misnomer. I would say that we are religious Jews. I think there is a question, what is now becoming emergent language is, are we halakhically, are we Jewish law observant? And I think that some ways yes, some ways no, but not to speak for Noah, but for myself, I can say that being Jewish and Jewish ritual and Jewish history really means a lot to me and shapes my life in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and Zoe said, in some ways yes, in some ways no. I would agree with that and add also for me, sometimes yes and sometimes no. Practicing what I'm drawn to, what challenges me, what moves me, what brings me closer to a greater power, God, Hashem, whatever we call it, closer to my Jewish self, closer to other individuals, Jewish and otherwise. So yeah, I think I try to keep my practice flexible with some firm boundaries of what I will not cross into for me personally. But I think it's a personal journey. And if you ask maybe like a very reformed secular Jew, am I religious? They would say yes. Yeah, right, or definitely right. Maybe a non-Jewish person who doesn't have a religious practice would be like, I've heard a lot like, oh my gosh, you are so religious. Right. But if you were to ask like a Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, is this person religious? Off the dare.
Hard no.
Definitely not
definitely
at all.
Off the dare.
So yeah, it's an individual journey, but I practice what feels good to me, which
is a very reformed way of approaching Judaism.
A theory I really ascribe to is that we all are more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I represent a lot of people that have done some terrible things, but part of my job is to get past that and humanize that person and connect this back to Judaism. I do think that Judaism really encourages us to understand all the different factors that may cause someone to make a decision. And it's more than just God telling us to do one thing or making us do one thing.
So we had a really great service where Terrell modeled for us what the Black Church is all about. He led a very vibrant and dynamic and passionate creative service, and Reverend Janet Garner-Mullins preached about what this pilgrimage means to her.
Let me tell you, that was not my plan. But the experience was an awesome experience. My mindset and my vision has always been, I don't want to just be a pastor of an African-American congregation. I want to see diversity. I want to see the unity of God's people coming together and worshiping Him, the true and living God. And so that did something for me in that moment where we were able to come together and begin to worship God. Regardless of what we called him, we begin to worship him.
Well, being a minister of the gospel, you're always on call, I tell people. So when I was asked to do a sermon for the group, it was nothing surprising. My sermon came from Psalm 133, unity. And my sermon basically was about unity in our diversity, because we need to be unified so we can do the work that we're called to do. And that's what I believe that I was given by God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, to talk about unity in our diversity.
I walked away with a lot of insights gleaned from Reverend Garner-Mullins, and just the power in her voice, and really coupled with this very grounded sense of both who she is and herself and in her Christian tradition and her faith, followed by a really passionate and powerful message and song leading from Pastor Terrell.
And while I wanted to participate, I can't sing a song that has Jesus in it, celebrating Jesus. I can't do that. And then when Janet got up there and talked about Jesus too, and it goes back to the question, these difficult conversations, that's when we need to have.
From an ecumenical perspective, you want to make sure that you are speaking in a way that all persons can connect. You recognize and appreciate their diversity in their religion, and you want to not get rid of yours, but you want to be able to blend what you're saying in such a way, just like a meal. Everybody at the table is not going to eat asparagus. Personally, I would not be eating asparagus, but there would be something else on the table that I can eat from. broccoli or something of that nature. And so the same way with the message, you want to put the message together that when you feed it to them, there's something that you fed them that they can eat.
The Old Testament is part of their religion, whereas the New Testament has nothing to do with my religion. So sometimes I think maybe it's a little bit easier for them to square Jewish experiences than for me to really participate in a Christian experience. I mean, there's no Jesus figure in Judaism. I mean, you have other prophets, but not the Son of God, not a name that is synonymous with God. That's not the Jewish experience. And so I definitely felt like more of an observer than a participant.
That's something we struggle with on the other side. And our lack of acceptance of Jesus has led to our persecution. Historic. That's our trigger. Absolutely. Right? So like, oh my gosh, that's my trigger, that's my trauma. And it's your beauty and joy. It's your when Janet did this and did the sacrifice, like it appears to me to be the deepest meaning. So how do we overcome, as Melvin said, that's a third place. How do we get out of my place and your place to that third place where we can see that?
I was uncomfortable on several levels, not because it was a church service, because God knows I sit through baccalaureate every year. I just didn't expect that on the Sunday morning service, given that they know we don't do Jesus.
I expected the name Jesus to come up in the worship service because it was a Christian worship service. I didn't particularly feel uncomfortable with that. I kind of saw the two worship services of like, this is the Jewish kind of service that we have guests in, and then in the Sunday morning worship service I felt like a guest, and not in a way of separating of like, well, you're not participating, you're not part of this, but just in like this isn't my tradition, and yet you're sharing something very powerful and meaningful to you with me, and vice versa.
But what was really cool to me, Terrell's been part of this for a long time. I've known him for a long time, but he's always been so quiet. He's never spoken up. This trip, I really saw him come out of his shell, especially that morning. So hearing him preach was kind of cool. Seeing him wear a tallis, that was pretty cool too.
The tallit represents the word of God. It represents wrapping yourself with the word. And so in ministry training and in church growing up, my pastor, Dr. Ralph Long, would have us to wear the tallit in prayer. And so in that moment, on that Sunday, I wore the tallit to let the people know, hey, we in this together, and we in this, and it's going to take prayer that's going to lead us out, and it's going to take the word of God that we're going to have to stand firm in what we believe, and knowing that God is still on the throne and he's still going to move through any obstacle that comes our way. And so in that moment when I put that tallit on, I knew I was wrapping myself in the word. I was wrapping myself in the promises of God, and we know that God's promises are yes and amen.
I thought the music was really good, and I thought that was a similarity that we were able to share from the Shabbat the night before. The music was kind of very similar, that celebratory type of music that just kind of generated the energy in the room. Yeah, I thought it went really well. I enjoyed it.
The service was eye-opening, and the service was challenging. I think we have a lot of work to do in understanding how we work together across faiths.
Initially, I went down expecting to just feel really rejuvenated. But what I wasn't ready for was how much hasn't changed. And for me, it was almost like I began to carry the burden all over again. And so I felt very heavy throughout the better part of the trip. You can walk into a museum and see all of the pain and suffering and oppression, and then you can walk out of the museum and see the pain and oppression and suffering. And I wasn't ready for that.
I thought the Legacy Museum reminded me a lot of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., in that it's very interactive. There's a ton of information to take in, but it's also about how you feel.
You go through slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and it's just the same iteration of oppression and discrimination and power over people, and yet also the continued fight for liberation and justice, and even like the joy that's experienced in all of that is just so powerful.
None of that information in the Legacy Museum was new to me. I mean, I work in this field every day, but I don't know how you could walk out of there not feeling sorrow, but also feeling motivated. Melvin said this on the bus, and it really stuck with me. He said something like, we can't let these people who suffered or who died have died in vain. And I think that was meaningful to me because I do think that's what I try to do in my job.
Even though there was the sights and sounds of horror, they were there in a way to make you look at, this is what took place. Now, what are you going to do with this pain? How are you going to take this pain and go forward? Are you going to wallow in it, or are you going to let the pain elevate you to a point where you ask yourself, what can I do? How can I be of service to make this better?
I think no matter how many times I hear this story, how many times I know about these tales, it's different every time. And it gets heavier each and every time. Blacks from Africa are kidnapped, taken to America, and it starts off with just like this huge wave of, I'll just kind of categorize it as emotions, right? Where you're like really immersed in that. And then it just walks through the whole tale. But the kind of crescendo, if you will, is just like this magnificent tribute, if you will, of Black excellence. And for me as a Black man, having all those figures look down on me in that room just really like encouraged me. It was hugely beneficial. That's one of the things that I definitely took away from this trip.
Museums can be really easy to walk through sometimes because it is such an academic experience, but the Legacy Museum and the Memorial are the inverse of that. They do not want you to walk passively through these spaces. You are forced to engage with them on a very somatic level, and I was really kind of afraid of what that would look like.
First, I'll say to Brian Stevenson and his whole team, they've done a wonderful job with all of that, from crossing the ocean, right, in bondage to up to the school to prison pipeline. Like, it was just, the story was so well told, and the continuity of the story was there. But again, it was very heavy. The beautiful thing that they've done with this museum is the last stop, which is the resting room, the relaxation room, is filled with images from the floor to the ceiling of all of these wonderful Black folks who have done wonderful things, though some you may know, some you may not know, but it's beautiful faces of positivity that you get to rest on, right? Leaving all of that oppression behind. And so I thought that was a wonderful touch.
It was intersectional, you know, we had men, women, younger people, older people, queer people, all kinds of folks just holding the container of that room and that space was really powerful.
Both the lynching museum and the lynching memorial are so intense. They trigger such trauma. You know, I think we could really, be there for one another and take time to process that. Also, what was intriguing was that there's so much skill within our group. We have social workers who can handle the processing. So I love that we each bring different gifts to the program.
It was just so incredible. And then you go to the lynching monument. Between the two of them, it's like going to the Holocaust Museum in DC or Yad Vashem. To do it with people that you've developed really strong relationships with and know pretty well at this point made it all the more meaningful.
I thought visiting that site that I would experience the pain. But when I got there, that wasn't the case. I kind of got angry over again, knowing that each of those markers, represented, the thousands of folks that have been lynched.
And then that night, to talk about it with everybody, it was just an incredibly powerful experience.
Selma is deep. If you could take the experience of what you've read, seen, and even had when you would go through those museums, and think about it as that's like what happened at a point in time, and just apply it to a 2022 version. That's what you would see if you were to go to Selma. Not to speak disparagingly against any of these places, not to, downplay all the good work that they're doing there, but there's some severe economic racism that you can kind of see expressed there that it's just racism in a different form. It may even be worse off than the 1960s.
Selma was difficult. I don't think anyone was expecting to see the level of poverty that we had seen. It literally looked like a town that had been abandoned since Martin Luther King went there.
I recognized very quickly that tourism was a major economic driver for that community. To juxtapose the tourism against what we saw in terms of the blight in the community, I felt like I was complicit.
Felt like a ghost town, there's no breath, there's no life. I think someone said there's no pulse here. So that was really shocking to me and felt just like eerie almost being there. And also just holding like how much history has happened there, and yet we have Black Americans just living in such destitute poverty there right now. There's this interesting mix of a feeling of hopelessness in addition to like rage and passion and how could this be. And one conversation we had leaving Selma was like, we also have this here, right, in and around Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think part of our resolution was like, well, let's start here.
Selma still looks like Selma. Was I looking for it to have changed? Yes. I felt that because there's so much tourism in Selma, that some of those tourism dollars would have been used to repair, replace, install, erect new infrastructure. But I didn't see that. The plight is still there. The decay is still there. This has been going on for how many years? And so when do we turn the corner here? When do we see Selma reborn?
That's the Black experience all over the world, where you have this kind of prostitution of the Black race, talking about their experience, talking about how negative it is. From where we come, we call it slave porn, where it's like, oh man, people really get off on seeing that type of stuff, but it's like, we need to change that.
So I think there was a lot of anger from our group. I was really surprised, I thought that, on the bridge out of Selma, that people would be really like transformed, what's next, right? But they couldn't get past the poverty and the anger they felt.
And so by the time it was time to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it wasn't a graceful walk for me. It was a burdensome walk, because I felt like I was contributing right back to the thing that John Lewis and all of those that marched across that bridge have been fighting for so long.
First of all, it's on a very busy road. It's very loud. The river was low tide. It smelled. So nothing about walking across the bridge really made me feel anything.
I was really focused on being present and taking that journey. It did feel unalive, it felt dead, which in some ways might be positive, right? Like, it's called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Like, do we really want to memorialize that? Like, no.
So in a way, it was disappointing, but also a reminder, in Judaism, you don't worship idols, and that bridge is just a bridge. What's important is the work we're doing going forward.
I think a difficult conversation that needs to be had is kind of the role of this group within the broader Charlotte community. I think there is a deep commitment to internal dialogue and understanding each other through conversation. If we're committed to change outside of our group, what does that look like? What form do we want it to take? And then also, I think a reconciliation of Charlotte's Jewish Black past.
The first thing I would say, and this is coming from a Black lens, is that silence is complicity. The Jewish community benefited, right, on the exploitation of the black community. Now, while many of them, and I would say probably the larger majority of them, didn't participate in it, participation and benefiting are two different things. If you choose to remain silent in the moments of someone's oppression and you are reaping a benefit from it, that means you are privileged. The opposite of privilege is oppression. You can't have one without the other. And so if you are privileged from what was happening and you're silent, then you're complicit in that oppression. And I think that's one of those conversations that you just cannot overlook. You got to look at it head on, stare it in the eyes, and acknowledge it and say, okay, because the next step from that is now how do we build equity, right? Because the only way you get equity is for those people in places of privilege to acquiesce some of that privilege. That's the only way you get equity.
So a main difficult conversation that needs to be had is religion. We were taught one way, and that one way was always the best way. And so to actually have a conversation about religion and understand that everyone doesn't have to believe the same thing that you believe to be right.
You know, you have Islam, you have Christianity, and you have Judaism, and they all have that initial kind of original story, but obviously there are different paths where they all split and diverge. So one of the deepest conversations we had as a group was, why don't Jews view Jesus as a Messiah? And that was one that we had in an intimate setting. It was a close conversation, but it's just a start.
You have some individuals that believe in Jesus as the Christ and some who don't. And, it's for all, it may be an uncomfortable conversation because you have to go into the conversation knowing that, hey, I'm not trying to convert or pull you to one side or the other, but I do want to see it from your point of view.
We need to have some critical conversations around religion, and we need to have some critical conversations around privilege. Are Jewish people privileged versus black people not being privileged? Let's have some conversation about that. Some people may say, well, no, we're not privileged. And some blacks may say, well, yes, we are privileged. So it's good to have that dialogue and want to have dialogue around oppression. Some people say that the oppression that the Jews experienced during the Holocaust and the oppression that African Americans continue to have are two different oppressions. What is the difference? And how does the difference look to you as a Jew? And how does the difference look to you as an African American?
I would also say from the black community that there are things that we need to understand in terms of our internalization of oppression, right? We internalize the oppression and live out that oppression, right? And I think that was very salient in Selma. That was what we were seeing. And I would say the same thing for the Jewish community. I think the Jewish community has internalized some of the oppressions on their communities, right? And they have to be able to acknowledge that as well.
Personally, and probably how I got involved in this program is I do think there needs to be conversations within the Jewish community on how they want to be in this fight.
We do have to talk about, obviously, Jewish racism and black anti-Semitism. Louis Farrakhan, for example. From my understanding, he has done a lot for the black community. The Million Man March was a very impactful and significant cultural event for the black community. But he has been unapologetic in his virulent and cruel anti-Semitism. But then also just even on lower level, like how different people understand what racism and white supremacy are.
Conversation around the parallels between Palestinian lives and Black lives, right? Which is sort of the big, I think, hot button topic. That's probably avoided in a lot of spaces because it's super uncomfortable. It's also, in my opinion, very nuanced.
I would like to address Palestine for sure. I'm not that versed on that topic, and I would like to have that discussion, especially because the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that I like to identify with are supporters of Palestine. And I want to be able to have educated conversations on that relationship.
One of the big reasons I think is important to have those foundations of strong relationships and knowing each other as people is to be able to have conversations like that and view this as like, this is my friend, this is a person that I know and care about, and I'm listening to their thoughts and their perspectives.
I hope that we were able to do this again. I hope that the second cohort, the third cohort, and the 30th cohort are able to come together and take these trips and have these discussions and then reflect on them. And I think the most important part about it is not just to have the experience, but to say, hey, what can I do with that experience?
I hope that it will, in a way, start to rebuild the relationship. I think it's time, especially with the challenges that the country's facing, like on democracy and civic engagement, civic welfare. This is the time for the Black-Jewish relationship to grow and work together.
You know, I'm looking forward for us to actually, you know, be the change that Charlotte is needing in this moment. You know, getting other young people involved, getting other older people involved, letting them know, hey, united, we got to stand. United, we got to be in this together. And if we in it together, then we can't fail. We can't lose because we in it together.
We actually cannot do this work of combating the hate, whether it be racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or homophobia or any other ism of hate. We need one another to come together in order to fight it. There are many people who want to create wedges between us, and they successfully have. But there is so much power and so much potential of this Black-Jewish alliance to have a positive impact on Charlotte and the broader region and country.
This is important information. Go ahead, Will.
The skeleton that didn't cross didn't get to go to the Friday night prom. Did you hear about it?
No. Yes. Tell them they don't know.
Didn't have the guts.
Do you know?
No, that's the road.
That's crossing the road.
Body.
Yeah.
Nobody
you know
why?
He didn't have a body to cross with?
He didn't have anybody.
He
He didn't have
anybody to go with.
Tomato.
Take him in a walk home.
Mahatma Gandhi said, we must be the change we wish to see in the world. And I tell everybody on my tours, I say, point to yourself. I must be the change I wish to see in the world, because every day we're choosing to love and receive and accept and appreciate one another in our diversity.